The alarm tore through my headset before I even reached the airlock, and my hands were already shaking on the release lever. Hull breach confirmed. Life support failing. 11 days adrift. Those words meant one thing in my line of work. We were probably too late. My name is Daniel Whitfield. I run search and rescue for the Colonial Defense Corps, and I have pulled people out of burning wrecks more times than I can count, but nothing that night prepared me for what was waiting on the other side of that broken hull. The ship belonged to the Kesserine, a species we barely understood. Proud, private, almost impossible to read. Their scout vessel had been hit by raiders 11 days earlier, and by the time our sensors picked up the weak distress signal, most rescue teams had already given up hope of finding anyone alive inside. I did not give up hope. I never do. The corridor beyond the airlock was dark, except for the beam of my flashlight cutting through drifting dust and torn metal. My breath sounded too loud inside my helmet. Every few steps, sparks fell from a broken conduit overhead, and the whole ship groaned like it wanted to fold in on itself. My squad mate, Carter Boyle, kept close behind me, scanning every shadow with his light. "Anything?" he asked, voice tight. "Nothing yet," I said. "Keep moving." We passed 3 sealed compartments before we found the first body. I will not describe what 11 days without power does to a ship's crew, only that it told me this mission had already failed. My chest tightened with that familiar, heavy feeling I get when a rescue turns into a recovery. I pushed it down and kept walking, because somewhere on this ship, my scanner still read one faint heat signature. 1. It was coming from a maintenance locker at the end of the corridor, barely big enough to hold a supply crate. I motioned for Carter to stay back and knelt beside the locker door. My hands were steady now. Whatever was behind that door needed calm, not panic. "This is Corporal Whitfield," I said softly, even though I doubted anyone inside could understand me. "I am opening this door. You are safe." I pried the panel loose. Inside, pressed into the corner with her knees pulled to her chest, was a child. She could not have been older than 6 by human standards. Her skin held a pale violet shade, her eyes large and glassy, rimmed with a second, thinner eyelid that blinked sideways when my flashlight hit her face. She looked so small against the torn metal around her, and so completely terrified, that for a moment I forgot she was not human at all. She flinched hard when the light touched her, and pressed herself further into the corner, letting out a sound that was somewhere between a whimper and a warning. "Hey," I said, lowering my light so it no longer pointed at her face. I set my rifle down slowly, deliberately, where she could see it, and pushed it away with my boot. "Hey, it is okay. I am not going to hurt you." She did not understand a single word. I knew that. But fear does not need translation, and neither does patience. I stayed low, made myself smaller, kept my voice steady, the way I would with any frightened child pulled from a disaster. Carter crouched beside me. "Sir, Command is going to want to know about this immediately." "Not yet," I said. "Let her calm down first." It took almost 20 minutes before she unfolded even slightly. 20 minutes of me talking softly about nothing important, offering her a strip of ration bar, keeping every movement slow. When she finally reached out and took the ration bar from my hand, her small fingers trembling, something in my chest loosened for the first time since we boarded that ship. She did not eat the ration bar. She just held it, staring at me. "Come on," I said gently, holding out my hand. "Let us get you somewhere warm." She looked at my hand for a long moment, then at the darkness behind her, then back at my hand. Finally, she reached out and gripped 2 of my fingers. I carried her the rest of the way, because her legs were shaking too badly to walk. She buried her face against my shoulder and did not let go. Not during the trip back through the wreckage, not when we passed the parts of the ship I made sure to shield her eyes from, not even when we finally reached the shuttle and the artificial gravity settled beneath our feet. I did not know, in that moment, that I was holding the entire future of an empire in my arms. Back aboard our carrier, the medical bay buzzed with quiet urgency. Dr. Grace Holloway ran her scanner over the girl twice, frowning at readings none of us fully understood. "Her vitals are stable," Grace said, "but she will not let go of you, Corporal, not even for the scan." That much was obvious. The girl had both fists locked into my jacket, her small body pressed against my side, refusing to be examined unless I stayed within arm's reach. Grace adjusted her approach, working around the girl instead of trying to separate us, and slowly, carefully, confirmed what I already suspected. Malnourished, dehydrated, frightened beyond anything a scanner could measure, but alive. She is a survivor, Grace said quietly. 11 days alone in the dark, and she made it. I looked down at the girl, who had finally, allowed her eyes to close, still gripping my jacket even in sleep. Yeah, I said, she is something else. Captain Louise Bennett found me an hour later in the observation deck, still holding the sleeping child, because every time I tried to set her down, her small hands would tighten, and her eyes would snap open in panic. Corporal, Louise said, keeping her voice low, we have a problem. That ship was flying under a diplomatic transponder we did not recognize until 20 minutes ago. It belonged to the Kesserine Royal Court. My stomach dropped. Royal Court? We are still confirming details, but preliminary translation suggests this child is connected to the throne. Possibly directly. Louise's eyes moved to the sleeping girl, then back to me. The Kesserine do not exactly advertise their family lines to outsiders. We had no idea they even had an heir this young. She is just a kid, I said, maybe too sharply. Whatever else she is that first. Louise held up a hand, not unkindly. I am not disagreeing with you. I am telling you that in the next few hours, this ship is going to have visitors, and I need you ready for that. I did not fully understand what she meant until 3 hours later, when every alarm on the carrier went off at once. The dreadnought dropped out of slipspace so close to our hull that the shockwave rattled every loose panel on the ship. Even through the viewport, its size was staggering, a mountain of dark metal bristling with weapon ports, all of them, according to Louise's tactical readout, fully charged and aimed directly at us. They are hailing, our comms officer said, voice cracking slightly. No words, just an open channel. Let it through, Louise ordered. The bridge fell silent, except for the low hum of static. Nobody spoke on the other end. Nobody needed to. The message was clear in the way those weapons stayed locked onto us, in the way the silence stretched out like a blade held just above the skin. I stood near the back of the bridge, the girl still asleep against my shoulder despite the chaos, and I understood, with a cold certainty, exactly what was about to happen. Somewhere out there was a mother who believed her child was dead, and she had crossed known space with enough firepower to erase our entire carrier from existence on the smallest provocation. Corporal Whitfield, Louise said, not turning from the viewport. Bring her to the primary airlock, now. I moved fast, cradling the girl carefully so the sudden motion would not wake her into a panic. Carter fell into step beside me, weapon lowered but ready, though we both knew that if this went wrong, no amount of readiness would matter. The airlock hissed open before we even reached it. What stepped through was not what I expected, even after every briefing I had read about the Kesserine. I had pictured armor, teeth, claws raised in threat. What I saw instead was a tall figure, dark violet skin marked with faint silver patterns, moving with a rigid, controlled urgency that reminded me of every parent I had ever seen running toward an emergency room. Behind her, a dozen armed guards fanned out into the corridor, weapons raised the instant they saw me holding the girl. I froze. Every instinct told me to raise my hands, to prove I was no threat, but any sudden movement might be read as exactly the wrong thing. The girl stirred against my shoulder. Her eyes opened, unfocused for a moment, then locked onto the figure standing in the airlock. A sound left her that I will never forget, part cry, part relief. The universal sound of a child recognizing safety after unbearable fear. Mama, she said, or something close enough in her own language that I understood it instantly. The guards' weapons wavered. The tall figure, the one I now understood to be the queen herself, went completely still, her eyes, wide and dark, fixed on the girl in my arms, as if she could not fully believe what she was seeing. For a long moment, nobody on that ship moved. Then the girl reached both arms toward her, and something in the queen's posture broke. She crossed the distance between us in 3 strides, guards parting instantly, and I loosened my grip the moment she reached for her daughter. The girl practically threw herself into her mother's arms, small hands gripping the fabric of her mother's coat, exactly the way they had gripped mine only hours before. The queen held her so tightly, I worried for a moment it might hurt, but the girl did not seem to mind at all. She buried her face against her mother's neck, and the queen closed her eyes, her whole body trembling with a relief too large for words. Nobody spoke. Nobody needed to. I stood there, hands still slightly raised, watching a mother discover her child was alive after 11 days of believing the opposite. It was, without question, the most human moment I had ever witnessed from a species I barely understood. The girl finally lifted her head from her mother's shoulder and turned toward me, small hand pointing in my direction. She spoke rapidly, the words tumbling over each other in a language I could not follow, but I caught something in the middle of it that sounded almost like my own name, twisted slightly by a 6-year-old's accent. "Ellie," she said, pointing again. "Ellie." The queen's eyes lifted to meet mine for the first time. I had read the reports. I knew the Kesserine were considered unreadable by human standards, their expressions too alien for our instincts to interpret. But there was nothing unreadable about the look she gave me in that moment. It was the look of someone measuring a debt too large to calculate. "You found her," the queen said. Her translator rendered the words flat and mechanical, but something in the way she said them carried weight anyway. "Alone, in the dark." "Yes, ma'am," I said, keeping my voice steady, even though my heart was still hammering. She was hiding in a maintenance locker. Scared, but alive. "You did not know who she was." It was not a question, but I answered anyway. "No, ma'am. Would not have mattered if I did." The queen studied me for a long moment, her guards still tense behind her, weapons lowered now, but not fully stowed. The girl, still held securely in her mother's arms, kept glancing back at me with something that looked almost like pride, as if she wanted her mother to understand exactly what had happened down in that broken ship. Louise stepped forward carefully, her hands open at her sides. "Your Majesty, we did not know your daughter was aboard that vessel. Our only priority was locating survivors. Corporal Whitfield acted exactly as he would for anyone we find in that situation." The queen did not look away from me. "That is precisely why it matters," she said. She turned slightly, addressing her guards in her own language, and the weapons I had almost forgotten were still aimed at our ship, lowered fully, then powered down entirely. The tension that had gripped the bridge for the last hour finally began to ease, though nobody quite relaxed, not yet. "My daughter tells me you gave her food," the queen said, turning back to me. "That you spoke to her gently, that you did not force her from the place she felt safe until she was ready." "She had been through enough," I said simply. Did not seem right to add to it. Something shifted in the queen's posture, something I could not fully name, but recognized instantly as respect. She stepped closer, still holding her daughter, and inclined her head toward me, a gesture that made every guard in that corridor go rigid with surprise. "Then you have my house's gratitude," she said, "for as long as either of us draws breath." I did not know, standing there in that corridor with my heart still racing, that those words would echo far beyond that single moment. I did not know they would reshape an entire relationship between two species who barely trusted each other. I only knew that a frightened child was finally safe, and that felt like enough. The weeks that followed moved faster than I expected. What could have become a diplomatic disaster, an armed Kesserine dreadnought facing off against a human carrier over a misunderstanding, instead became the opening move in negotiations that had stalled for years. Nobody wanted to be remembered as the side that let tension boil over after a rescue like that. And within a month, agreements that had gathered dust for a decade finally moved forward. I did not take part in any of those negotiations. That was never my role. I went back to search and rescue, back to pulling people out of wrecks that made the news for a day and were forgotten the next. But every year, on the same date, a letter arrives for me, translated carefully into English by someone in the Kesserine court, filled with updates about a girl who is growing taller, learning faster, and still, apparently, telling anyone who will listen about the human soldier who found her in the dark. People sometimes ask me if I understood, in that moment, what I was doing. If I knew I was holding the future of an empire in my arms. If I understood the weight of what almost happened when that dreadnought arrived ready for the worst. I did not know any of that. I only knew there was a scared child in a broken ship, and my job was to make sure she made it out alive. That is the whole truth of it. No plan, no strategy. Just a hand held open instead of closed, and a promise kept long enough for someone else's fear to finally let go. Sometimes that is all it takes to change everything,